Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Ed. They left the overlook at dawn, leaving the place well stocked. They might get a bit hungry on the ride back to the wall, but they would be traveling light. They needed to. As they started off, that lingering feeling of being watched was still there. It nagged at him. It nagged at others. Ser Jeremy felt the same way, given his barked commands to hurry. They rode at a canter down the valley that led to the overlook. Riding in a line, all in black, all with grim faces. They were being watched. They could all tell. They made good time that first day. South, headed towards the Milkwater. They'd follow that south to the Shadow Tower and the safety of the wall there. And with every mile south, that feeling of being watched ebbed away until it was just a slight itch between his shoulder blades. A fast trip to the wall, Ser Jeremy told them as they made camp at the end of the day in a grove of trees that would hide the light of their fire from any prying eyes. We get to the Shadow Tower, and then we head to Castle Black on the south side of the wall. The night was quiet. Ed stood his 2-hour watch as the others slept in their furs by the crackling fire, walking carefully through the trees and keeping his eyes away from the light. Twice he saw movement and froze. The first time was a snowy owl, drifting through the air on silent wings. The second time was a snow fox, a limp hair in its jaws as it loped along. There was nothing else. The next day started well, but then tragedy struck. Old Fran, the veteran of the group, was riding along with a hare, broke from cover right under the hooves of his horse, which reared up suddenly. Fran was sent flying off his saddle and hit his head on a rock. By the time that Ed got to him, he was dead. It was senseless. He stood over the body of his old brother helplessly and shook his head at Ser Jeremy, whose jaw tightened with anger. And now his watch is ended. Ser Jeremy muttered as the others joined in raggedly. We don't have time to burn him. Brothers, keep riding. I will make sure that he doesn't rise as a wight by some passing other. Ed nodded and led the others away from Ser Jeremy, who was standing over Fodden's body with his sword drawn. Some minutes later he rejoined them, riding hard, his face grim. Such a stupid death, Ser Jeremy muttered. A seasoned brother killed by a fall from a horse. Friends of death cast a pall over them, as they kept riding south. As they made camp in another copse, at the end of the second day, the pall had lifted a little, but it was still there in the subdued gestures and quiet mutters of the men. They would be all right in the morning. He knew it. But dawn came early that night. He was shaken awake, not long past midnight, judging by the moon. And then he joined the others in staring straight south at the great glow on the horizon. Fires in the night, Rollin muttered. Fires set by wildlings. The half-hand said that he'd seen them. But that's a greater fire than any I've ever seen before. It's huge. Why would they set such fires? Gerald rumbled. Whites, Ed replied, his throat tightening with fear. Whites and others. Fire is said to deter them. A fire that big. I told Ed. There must be a powerful number of them there. And they're between us and the wall. Damn it. He chewed at his lip for a moment. We'll not risk it. We dare not. Right. Straight east tomorrow. Brothers. East to Craster's Keep, and then south. Ed looked at him worriedly. Begged pardon, Ser Jeremy. But didn't the first ranger say that Krister wasn't to be trusted anymore? Aye, he did. Ser Jeremy sighed. We'll not visit his keep, even though I'd like to reprovision there. Riding east will add days to our journey, but we cannot take the choice. He had a point, and then men grunted in agreement and nodded. Some of them a little reluctantly, but they nodded. Ed stood the next watch, and as he patrolled, he kept looking at the glow to the south. Wildlings on the run, fighting off others and whites. It made him shudder, and watch the shadows even more carefully. But nothing disturbed them that night. If Ser Jeremy had pushed them briskly, heading south, their eastward ride was harder. He urged them along with many a hard stare to the south, and again he was right to do so. The feeling they were being watched came back again that day. It was strongest at noon, but then fell away again. He didn't know who was watching them or perhaps what was the better word for it, but they were out there. Once again, the others felt it as well, or picked up on the fact that some were sensing something. And so it was, with no small amount of relief, that he saw the shape of Warm Springs up ahead. The crag that held a cave with a pool of warm water, fed by a hot spring. It had the most unoriginal name ever, but it was a welcome sight as the sun set. "We may camp at Warm Springs," Sutter Jeremy told them. "'Tis a good place to rest and also defend. Wash too, brothers. I don't know about you lot, but I smell." They laughed a bit at the weak joke, but once they were all in the cave, with the horses by the entrance and a fire being lit on the flat stone above and to one side of the pool, the tension ebbed again. The water was warm, and once he had scrubbed himself with the shard of soap he carried for such things, he felt a new man. He felt even better when Othor cooked the brace of conies that he'd killed at noon the previous day and which had been hanging from his saddle ever since. It wasn't much, but every ranger had a pot of dried vegetables somewhere in his saddlebags for just such an eventuality, and the small pot that Gerald carried was enough to hold coney stew for them all. As they ate they talked, and after a while Krister came up as a topic of conversation. "Never trusted that bloody man," Roland muttered as he gnawed on a leg bone. "Shifty-eyed bastard." There was some general mutters of agreement, although Lauren Hill rolled his eyes a bit, probably having heard something different from Roland some time before. "You didn't mind him before." "That was before I heard he worshipped the others," Roland grunted as he threw the leg bone into a corner, before looking at a dragonglass spearhead and then starting to bind it onto a spare spear shaft. They'd all been doing it in the past few days. A spearhead here, an arrow there. Ed now had a dragonglass dagger in a sheath at his right side. How a man could do that, it beyond me. Why would he do that? Ed stared at him. The man has umpteen wives, many of whom are his own bloody daughters, who he makes more daughters with. The man's a monster. Various faces were pulled at that. All kinds of men were in the Night's Watch, for all kinds of reasons, many of them unsavory, but all could agree on that one point. "I wonder why he's not going south with the rest of the wildlings," Tywin asked. "Raider said that he worshipped the others." Sasharmi muttered, "He wouldn't be welcome south of the wall. I'm not sure that we'd want him south of the wall anyway." Which was a good point. But something else had occurred to Ed. Wait a moment. He has daughters with his wives. He marries his daughters, and has more daughters. Where are the sons? Everyone looked at each other, and then various shrugs were shrugged, not least by Rollin, whose face screwed up, as if he had only just thought about that. And then Othor laughed and led them all in a jolly song. Ed went to sleep that night with a warm meal in his belly, and for once the roster meant that he didn't have to get up and stand a watch in the middle of the night, so when they left the next morning, he was well rested. He needed to be, because he and Serduni took point, and the night was in a hurry again. And soon knew why. That feeling was back again, and it grew worse by the hour. Until noon, when Serduni adjusted their path a little more southwards, after which it eased again. What was out there? He didn't want to know that. Instead, he and Serduni led them on through the trees and the snow, along the low rocky hills and the tree-covered other hills. And all through their journey they kept seeing signs of one thing. Abandoned wildling settlements were all over the place. Some had faint tracks going south from them. Some didn't. Some had been stripped off everything. Some hadn't. They avoided those. Ed wondered about what had happened in those places. For a while at least. Then he stopped thinking about it. He had to. One village had a small doll, one as for a child in it, by the door to a hut. The door frame and the doll were covered in dried and frozen blood. They rode away from that village in a hurry. They finally caught sight of Krister's keep, the day after the encounter with the village. It was a large wooden building on a hill with a dike around it, and they saw it from the cover of some trees to the westward. "We avoid that bloody place," Sarah Jeremy said through gritted teeth, "and that bloody man." But that bloody man came to them. As they rode through the trees, Ed could see movement in a clearing ahead of them, and raised a fist in the air, bringing them all to a halt. He peered through the trees. There was a man walking in the snow in the distance. He passed parallel to their position, as they stood there at least 200 yards away. It was Craster, a big bulky man, with gray hair. He seemed to be holding something in his arms, as he trudged through the snow. "What's he doing?" Ed muttered at Sarah Jeremy, who gestured at them all to be quiet. The former Crownlander knight peered through the trees and then waved at them all to dismount and then their horses to the strongest branches. "Something's not right here," he muttered to them as they all joined him. "What's that bloody man doing out here? What's he holding? We follow him, deep in the cover of the trees, brothers." They did so, as quiet as they could, leaving Gerald to wait, with the horses. They stayed well away from the tree line, watching as the man walked through the snow. He seemed to be heading towards a place with an altar, a stone slab at least. Craster leant down, placed a small bundle on the slab, and then stood there for a moment, and then he looked north, seemed to shiver a little, and then walked quickly away, back south towards his keep, as fast as he could. They waited until Craster had long since passed from sight before then approaching the bundle. When Ed was about 20 yards away, he paused, shocked. A thin, high wail suddenly split the air, and then he rushed over and peered at the bundle. A small, scrunched-up face peered back at him, and then it wailed in protest. "It's a bairn," he said, as he picked up the little bundle and then faced the others. "A baby?" Sir Jeremy had turned as white as milk. "Is it a boy or a girl?" He paused and then gingerly pulled the small clothes apart, until he could see what was inside, before hastily covering it again. "A boy, Sir Jeremy," he muttered, shocked, as his words produced white vapor almost in shock as well. "A boy. Now we know what he does with them," Sir Jeremy said, with his mouth twisted in revulsion. "Leaves them out for the elements to kill them. Can't have a child with a son." Ed nodded, and then he paused. A cold mist was rising around them, and with every breath he took the white vapor seemed to thicken. "It's getting colder," he said out loud. And then he looked about wildly as his sixth sense suddenly screamed at him. "Sir Jeremy, it's getting colder." Sir Jeremy also looked about, a curse on his lips. "Brothers, beware." The others rushed towards them, spears out and swords drawn, all then facing outwards. And then, as the mist seemed to almost thicken in the air, they saw it. It was white and blue, in the shape of a man, but with eyes that burned like blue stars in the night sky, and clad in nothing but a loincloth. Wispy white hair fell to its shoulders, and its skin looked stretched and almost leathery, pulled taut in places like its ribs. It did not seem to breathe as it stood there, but it lived. Its hands opened and closed for a moment in a gesture that made Ed shiver. It was staring at Ed, or rather at the baby boy in his arms. Everything seemed frozen in time at that point. Everyone was staring at it, and then the moment broke as the other stepped forwards, straight at Ed. Jorik was the nearest to the thing, a young ranger from the Iron Islands originally, with a sword that he had forged himself. It did him no good. He let out a wild cry and then slashed at the creature as it passed him. The blade never met its target. Instead, the other, moving with almost inhuman speed, grabbed the sword and slowed it, and then it clenched its fingers and the sword shattered into 1,000 pieces, like dust on the wind. Jorik gaped at the remains of the hilt, and then the creature backhanded him about the head, twisting his neck with a sickening crack that left him tumbling lifelessly backwards. And then it looked at Ed and started to walk towards him. Dragging glass. Someone shouted the word, and after a heartbeat he realized that it had been him. Use the dragging glass. Uther was the nest closest, and he hefted a spear and then jabbed it at the other. The creature, still moving at that inhuman speed, dodged it and then grabbed the spear below its head and broke it, before pulling it from Uther's grasp and plunging the broken shaft into the man's heart. Uther choked, and then collapsed. It was still coming towards him. The baby, he thought. It wants the baby. So he turned, threw the child towards the oncoming shape of Darwin, who dropped his spear and caught it with a curse, and then turned back. He had just enough time to see the arm of the other approaching his throat, and then his brain overrode his legs and he threw himself backwards into the snow. He hit with a thud that knocked the breath from his lungs, and he saw stars for an instant. Someone was screaming that they all had to pull back, and he looked upwards. Inhuman eyes passed over him, dismissed him, and then looked at Darwin, who was trying to hold the baby and also draw his sword. Dagger, his brain thought. Dagger. The word rambled through his head for a long moment, and then his hand went to his belt and scrabbled for a long, endless moment for the dragonglass dagger that was there. He grabbed it, watched the leg of the other at as stalked past him, and then thrust the dagger into it. It was like stabbing a frozen hunk of meat, but he used all his strength and then rolled away, looking desperately for another weapon. But the other had frozen in shock, and then it turned on him and let out a noise that sounded like the scream of a blizzard, as if frozen wind and broken ice were all screaming at the same time. The flesh of the leg where the dragonglass dagger was impaled had turned a strange off-white color, like ice that had been hit with a sledgehammer, and then fissures appeared in it. fissures that jagged their way upwards, spreading like nothing he had ever seen. The other flailed desperately at the dagger, clumsily, and then suddenly it collapsed and broke apart into nothing more than shards of ice and snow. The mist dissipated in the blink of an eye as a west wind suddenly blew, sending the shards flying. They all stared at the pieces as they fell to the ground, and then they melted in an instant. Ed reached out and with shaking hands picked up the dragon glass dagger, looking at it with wonder. "I killed it," he said shakily. "I killed it." There was a long moment, and then Sarah Jeremy collected himself, and then strode over and reached out a hand. "Well, Tollet," he said with a shaky smile. "Congratulations, you're the first man in thousands of years to kill another." Then the smile ebbed. "Let's find Krister and have a word with the bastard about what he's doing to his own sons, shall we?" "Maya." The neck stank. All that swamp, all that rotted vegetation, and then there were the eyes. There were Cranstonmen out there. She could sense them, feel them. They were out there. Not many, but they were there. She looked back at the long line of men and wagons, and then pulled a slight face. This was just the vanguard of what was eventually to come. Unless she missed her guess, the realm would rally to the north. But in the meantime, while she was in the tip of the vanguard, the 1,000 men and women heading north. North. Her dreams had been of the north. Dreams of a great wall of ice, of a forest and of a woman and a man who looked like the descriptions she'd heard of her father, and of something that wasn't human. She'd talked to Lord Royce about those dreams. He'd frowned, stared down at his runnered armor as he mulled things over, and then looked back at her. "Old things are waking," he'd told her, enigmatically. "The old blood sings, the blood of the first men, your father's blood amongst them." Talk of her father still unnerved her. She had vague memories of him, a big man with the black hair and blue eyes that she had inherited from him. But to think that he was the king, it still gave her goosebumps. Shorpath whickered a little at the stench of something particularly noxious, and she leant forwards and patted his neck to quiet him. He'd had a rough enough time on the voyage. Runstone could not call up Ogden a large fleet, but there had been just enough ships to get them through the Bight and to the King's Road at the Neck, where they had found such a combination of foul smells. For someone used to the Vale and the rocky paths that led to the Eyrie, the Neck had been an experience. Well, the trip itself had been an experience. Lord Royce's summons had been unexpected. Seeing Runstone again, well, she still shivered a little at that. The runes on the walls and the glowing runes elsewhere. So much was being prepared there. She hoped that her mules were all right. She also wondered just what would result from all of this. Lord Royce was supposed to be sworn to the Eyrie, and Lord Arryn, Lord Redford, too. She tried not to think of Michael, failed, cursed inwardly, and then pulled a face. Well, now, things would work themselves out there. Hopefully. The men ahead of her slowed, and she peered ahead. They were crowding together as they started down the proper causeway, as opposed to the approaches to it. It was a natural choke point, and a fell and dangerous one to a hostile force. Along they rode, evil-smelling swamp, to the right and the left. Occasionally she felt her scalp prickle, and she shivered a little. Yes, the tales were true. Crenagan were watching them in larger numbers now. They were not alone. It was almost a relief when she finally caught sight of Moat Cailin. That meant that they were coming close to the end of the Neck, and then she blinked. The old fortress was supposed to consist of 3 old towers, a lot of ruins and little else. Not any longer. There were 5 towers now, 2 that looked as if old stones had been reused to build them with new mortar. The curtain wall had been repaired in places, joining some of the towers, and there was the skeleton of a wooden keep growing in the center of it all. This was not a ruin anymore. There was life there. There was also a direwolf banner at the top of the towers, and another banner, one unfamiliar to her. A black lizard lion on a gray-green background. And there were riders coming south, down the causeway, with both banners flying from pennants. She heard hooves thundering behind her, and she looked over her shoulder as Lord Royce and Redford galloped past her, their cloth-covered armor hiding those runes. The same runes that were on her bracers now. Who rides with such force towards Moat Cailin in the north? The oncoming rider from the north had a loud voice indeed. Lord Royce had one that matched it. Lord Royce and Redford of the Vale. Then he paused and his jaw seemed to work a little under that beard. Lord Stark sent out the call. We remember. We have come. Those with the blood of the first men. those who remember. The riders came to a halt in front of the two lords from the Vale, and their leader peered at them both, before nodding with all seriousness. "Very well, my lords. A raven will be sent to Lord Stark in Winterfell to tell him of your arrival in the north," and then he seemed to hesitate for a moment, before nodding again. "My lords, the north remembers as well, and we will not forget this. I am cousin to Lord Reed of Greywater Watch. My thanks." Lord Royce and Redfort nodded back, and then they all started to trot down the causeway again, towards the ancient fortress. Hopefully the stink of the neck would leave them soon, but she still drummed her fingers on the pommel of her saddle. Her father was supposed to be in the north too. What if she met him? She sighed a little. Well, perhaps those damn dreams would stop. Asha. The harbor was bustling as she walked up the hill. The variety of ships was wide indeed, from the smallest of rowing boats to the great longships that had formerly been a part of Father's Iron Fleet. All were swarming with men and even women, as they were worked on with frantic haste. Ropes were being stared at for fungus, sails poured over, masts tapped for any rot, swords stacked and shields propped next to each other. Oars were being inspected, tillers scrutinized. The people of Harlaw were getting ready to fight. Some would no doubt die. She knew that. So did they. She also knew that they knew that there could be no other way. Even the few loyalists knew that something was in the air, that Lord Harlaw had to be followed if they were not all going to die. She had an odd feeling about that. There was indeed something in the air, something dark and terrible, and heading their way. Father's wrath could be terrible, his vengeance unpleasant to behold. Her nuncle, her sane one, was on the hill that looked over the harbor, talking to a number of men, many of whom were scowling with thought. She peered at that. They seemed to be thinking so hard that many of them were muttering under their breath. When Lord Harlaw finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then he looked around at the assembled men. "I don't like it either," he said grimly. "But we know what's going to happen if Danfair gets his clammy paws on us." There was another pause, and then the men all chorused, "Aye," and then they nodded and broke up, walking away. "A council of war, nuncle?" Asha asked, as she watched her uncle look out to sea. "More like orders to complete something that need to be finished in the next day or so. They're coming straight for us." "Asha, straight for us." A shiver stole its way up her spine. "How do you know that?" "A friend or two at Pike. My message had its correct effect. Danfair and your father have sent Victarion against Harlaw with what remains of the Iron Fleet. They have orders to take this island, to kill or enslave everyone on it, to burn down every building and to sow the fields with salt." The shiver came back. Yes, she could imagine father giving those orders, with Danfair, that fucking wild-eyed maniac, standing over his shoulder and shuddering with religious lunacy. "When?" she asked, the word in as level a voice as possible. Roderick Harlaw stared up at the sky for a long moment, as he studied the clouds, and then he turned his face to the wind. Only then did he turn back and speak. "Victarion's not an idiot, but he's caught between a rock and a kraken. He'll want time to prepare for an attack. It's time that your father and Danfair will not allow him. No, they'll send him straight at us. My letter to them did the job. I want them to target me first. Great Wick will need time to gather their forces." Winds changed. Day that our ships came in from the Iron Fleet anchorage, it was from the southeast. Now it's from the northeast, and it's a slack wind at that. The Targaryen ships will have to row at least part the way. Hard work rowing. You know it, I know it. The Targaryen will want to have his men rested enough to fight. They won't come tomorrow, or the day after. No, 3 days from now at dawn, we'll have to be ready. She looked at the sky herself and then nodded. 3 days from now. Robb. There was a great muttering in the hall of Castle Black as he walked in with his group of fellow lordlings around him. Jon was on his right and Theon on his left, with the Karstarks and the small Jon on his heels. It gave him an odd feeling at times to see the Karstark brothers again. Jaime Lannister had cut them down in an attempt to get at him at the Battle of the Whispering Wood. As he reached his chair, the others broke apart, with Theon striding off outside via the other door to where father was waiting. It was an effort at times to not react to that memory, that last sight of them as lifeless bloodied shapes on the ground, with the Kingslayer wheeling his horse about as he looked for him. The great Sean had clattered him out of his saddle. Memories of that other time could cloud his mind at times. He had to keep his thoughts clear, and at times he had to jest with men whom he had seen dead or maimed, to talk to Lord Karstark with the right level of politeness, at the same time remembering the moment that he had beheaded him, and watched the severed head rolling on the ground, and to converse with Roose Bolton, the man who had finished the job that the Frey crossbowmen had started. Yes, life could be hard, but he had to put all of that behind him. Had to. There was too much at stake. Off to one side, Tyrion Lannister was sitting, his eyes flickering over the assembled nobility of the north. The Lord Commander took his seat next to the Maester and the Master-at-Arms and then nodded at Robb, who turned his face to the doors. Megan Mormont had come to Castle Black barely an hour before, and she had already sent word to Father that she had to talk to him as soon as this meeting was concluded. It was unlike her to be so insistent, and he felt uneasy. Looking through the doors, he saw Theoden peering through, and then he nodded. He got a nod in response, and then Father swept in through the doors, the Gretchen at one shoulder, Roose Bolton at the other, and Lord Karstark bringing up the rear. "My lords," the Gretchen roared as they strode to the dais. The Warden of the North, Lord Eddard Stark, thanked the old gods that he hadn't referred to Father as the King in the North. That had been something that had preyed at his mind for the past few days. The lords, yes, and ladies, of the North stood almost as one as Father walked up the steps of the dais, carrying the Fist of Winter, which he hefted for a moment, and then placed heavily on the table in front of him. "My lords, pray be seated," Father rumbled. There was a further rumble as they did, with a lot of muttering. Robb led his group to some vacant seats at the front, where they were joined by Theon and Jon. Father didn't sit down, though. He stood and looked out over them all. Robb glanced over his shoulder. Yes, the full muster of lords was there, some of whom were not exactly friendly to House Stark. Barbary Dustin was sitting there to the right, her face like stone, her father, Lord Rhyswell, next to her. He had an odd expression on his face, as if he was worried about something. "My lords," Father said eventually, "winter is coming. Yes, I know that is the motto of my house, but it is also the reality that is facing us. The days are growing shorter. The Citadel might not have declared it yet, but winter is indeed coming, and we face a long winter. The second long night, perhaps, given how long this summer has been. Can anyone here deny that this coming winter will be as long?" There was a rumble of agreement, leavened by the thump of fists on the tables. "And then there is the call. Can anyone here deny that they heard it? Can anyone deny the warning?" More rumblings and then shaking of heads. "There will be those who ask how it was sent out. I was there when it happened. Long ago, my ancestors gave the Hearthstone to the Umbers, telling them to guard it and to bring it to Winterfell, if it ever changed color. It did indeed change color. My lords, when it was given to me, I saw the enemy. The others come, commanded by their master, the Night King." Father's voice was hoarse suddenly. "I have seen him, my lords. A creature of the night, all blue and white and evil. Hobemorn is his citadel, a place so far north that neither man nor horse could get there and live. He comes, they come, and so do their army of whites." A silence fell, a dark and terrible one, as everyone stared at Father, who set his chin a little. "My lords, we know that they are coming now. The call was sent when I reunited the Hearthstone with another artifact, found at Winterfell," and then he took a deep breath. "Much has been found at Winterfell, things that my father knew about, things that he was never able to tell me, because he was murdered." Another silence, and then shocked exclamations, as the lords of the North realized how closely they had come to no warning at all. Hugo Well, the leader of the largest and most powerful of the hill clans, seemed to be particularly affected, given his sudden pallor. "My lords," Father bellowed over the uproar. And then again, "My lords." Silence finally fell. "We know they are coming. We know that we have to act, now, to strengthen the Night's Watch, to support it, to call for help from the south. The call has helped with that. As I said, many things have been found, including this." He placed a hand on the fist. "This is the Fist of Winter, the ancestral weapon of the Starks, that we bore before we had ice. It was hidden in a secret room in my solar, which had been my father's solar before me. Our ancestors were wise. They secured many things against this day. Hugo Wall had turned white as a sheet and was having a frantic whispered conversation with Torgon Flint and Brandon Norrie, both of whom looked equally shaken. Working out what those things do will take time in some cases, but we have another problem. As the Night Kings and the others sweep south, they drive those people beyond the wall south. The wildlings, who call themselves the free folk, are fleeing south. Father placed both hands on the fist. I have spoken to Mance Rayder, the so-called king beyond the wall. He told me he could call upon a force of 100,000 to march against the wall. More mutterings, some angry and some shocked. What do you mean, could call, Lord Stark? Someone shouted. Rayder does not want his people to die. They have seen the others, fought them, lost to them. The legends of their powers are true, he says, but he will not send his warriors against the wall. He wants to save as many as possible. He is asked to pass his people through the wall and into the gift. He would have knelt to me to get permission to do so. Yet more muttering. The small John appeared to be quite angry, right up until the moment that his father strode up to him, spoke intently and then glowered at his son until the younger man looked shamefaced. My lords, father bellowed again. I know that the thought of allowing wildlings into the gift sounds like madness, but think of the facts. What the alternative to letting them, though, is, what happens if we don't let them in? Think of it, 100,000 of them, trapped north of the wall. My lords, that would mean 100,000 whites coming at us. Think on that for a moment. The muttering died in an instant. The silence that fell now was a long one, and more than a few men were as white as Hugo Wall had been earlier. He was now merely pasty. Father looked at the Lord Commander, who stood and glowered at everyone. You all know me, my lords. I have no liking for wildlings. But we cannot leave them to be massacred and then reanimated by the others. I do not like it, but it must be done. We must allow them into the gift. We will deny the Night King a source of whites, and we will be able to repopulate the gift and get crops growing in there again. We need them. The Lord Commander sat again and Father nodded at him. We need the South too. I know now that the call has been heard in many places. The blood of the first men sings. The mountain clans of the Vale have sent forces to our aid. And this time the silence was a stunned one. Lord Reswell broke it. The mountain clans of the Vale have come to our aid. They have. They came to Winterfell and have sworn to aid us. They march on the gift now. But we need more. We need the gold of the Westerlands and the knights of the Vale, the grain of the Reach, the iron of the Iron Islands, and the valor of the Stormlands and the Riverlands, as well as the spears of Dorne. We need the South, as did our ancestors. And the king is coming to Winterfell. King Robert has heard the call. The blood of the Durandons rings true in him. There was a scraping noise as Hugo Wall stood. Your pardon. Has the Meta Pristin. I beg your pardon, Lord Stark. Heard anything from the Thanard north of the wall since you found the Fist of Winter? Father looked at the Lord Commander for a moment and then nodded. According to the Lord Commander, the Thand have heard that I now wield the fist and are coming south. Why do you ask, Lord Walls? Lord Wall looked around at the other lords of the hill clans. Then he swallowed. There is a legend amongst our people, a tale. It's said that when the Stark in Winterfell holds the Fist of Winter and that the Thenans march to obey him, that a second long night will follow, because death marches on the wall. And then the longest silence of all fell. Edmure. They made camp about a day's ride from Riverrun, in an inn owned by a man who is frankly perpetually astonished that he was hosting Lord Hoster Tully's son, and the Blackfish, and the other man, the man with the horns on his hood, the Green Man. Uncle Brendan had been very enigmatic about the man. He's from the Isle of Faces, he'd said, before going off and having a long talk with the old man, as well as that odd woman. Now, she was an odd one. Blonde, plain to the point of almost ugliness. Almost as terse as Uncle, very good with a sword based on her sparring abilities. And, well, there was something about her that puzzled him. She had a link with Uncle Brendan that really confused Edmure, and possibly the other two as well. Tarth. He knew was an island off the coast of the Stormlands, and he knew all about Lord Tarth and his tragic tale of losing son after son. Well, Brienne of Tarth seemed to be very keen on making up for her lost brothers. She certainly knew a lot about armor, and weapons, and fighting styles. And now he'd had a plate of excellent ham, a mug of quite good ale, and he was standing outside the inn, and was staring at the stars. His failure at High Herret still gnawed at him. Yes, they'd won there, but that victory had only been down to the arrival of the others. If it had been just his men against those of Blackfoot, then he would have lost. He would have killed quite a few of them, but he would have lost, and his men would all be dead. He stared bleakly at the stars. He was an idiot. Too much time drinking, eating, and making girls with large bosoms squeak with pleasure. Not enough time learning about land and marching distances and tactics. If it hadn't been for Uncle Brynden and the Green Men, well, that mad Septon would have won. He looked back at the inn for a moment. At least that mad Septon was being quiet. He spent the first day shouting a lot about tricks and the evil of pagans, and then what had remained of his mind had cracked like an egg, and he'd wailed and screamed and voided himself all over the place. If his feet had been black before, they were now disgusting, or had been disgusting. He'd ordered the guards to dunk the wretched man in the nearest river. "You seem quiet, nephew," said the voice of Uncle Brynden to one side. "You're still thinking about High Heart." "Yes, Uncle Brynden. I was foolish." "No, you were a bloody idiot. The moment you saw that hill, you should have sent a few of your men up it to secure it, and then had the rest of your horse hidden nearby. You could have taken them in their flank then, especially as it was darkening quickly. They'd never have seen you coming." Edmure thought back on what had happened on the hill. "That's what you did, didn't you?" His uncle directed a wintry little smile at him. "Aye, we were coming around the hill. After seeing the light of their torches, then we saw you up there." He winced. "I didn't think. We could never hand charge down that slope." Uncle Brynden shrugged. "Everyone started off like you. You just need to not pull your head in and brood over it. Brooding kills, lad. You start thinking about you should or should not have done, and the next thing you know, you've got a head full of indecisive gibberish. The next time you fight, that kills people. Might even kill you. You're still young, you'll learn, you just need to learn faster." He stared at the older Tully. "Why, Uncle Brynden? What's going on?" "The small fall for all a buzz over this call. That cat's Ned somehow sent out." "And who is the Green Man? Why are the Green Men traveling outside the Isle of Faces again? Have they ever done that before?" Now it was Uncle Brynden's turn to stare up at the stars. "Winter is coming, Edmure. I know that's what the Starks always say, but they're always right. There's a winter coming that will be worse than anything we've ever seen. You see those stars up there?" Utterly confused, Edmure stared at where his uncle was pointing. "The crook, is it not?" "Aye, the crook. You can see its base, can you not?" Still confused, he looked at it. Some small stars could be seen at the bottom of it. "Ah, yes, I see them. How odd. Never seen those before." Uncle Brynden sent a withering look at him. "This world has shifted a little. Enough to mean that we have had a long summer. I can't remember one as long as this one, ever, in my lifetime. So now we face a long winter. I need to talk to your father about it, but you need to be ready for what's to come. The Starks will need help on the wall because what's on the other side is something that we need to fight with everything we have." And then he turned and strode off. Edmure stared after him, baffled, before shrugging and heading off to get some more ale. And then after a quiet mug or two, he made for his bed. Sleep did not come easily to him. Uncle Brynden's words kept running through his mind. A long winter. It was true that this present summer had been a long one indeed. Did that really mean an equally long winter? He'd never really thought about it. He finally dropped off and had some very odd dreams indeed. They left for River Run early the next day, after tipping the landlord a handful of silver. As they rode off, he noticed that two of the Green Men split off from the main body and rode off, one heading west and the other east. He thought about asking where they were off to, but didn't. The Green Man did not seem to be someone who suffered fools gladly, still less idle questions. By the time they reached River Run, the Mad Septon had been dunked twice more in the nearest river, due to, well, being a literal shit. And the Green Man was in the middle of another intense conversation with Uncle Brynden and Brienne of Tarth. When he caught sight of River Run, the old man paused and seemed to sigh deeply, before shaking his head a little. Seeing Edmure staring, he smiled slightly. Old memory. People cheered him as he led them all through the gates and into the main courtyard. All his men, cavalry and foot, had returned, and that had been noticed by many. He liked that, even if he still felt like an idiot. The sight of the Green Men got a few odd looks. Not that many seemed to know who, or rather what, They were. However, as he dismounted and looked around, he heard one man gasp with shock. Father was standing in a doorway. He still did not look well at all, but he was now as white as a sheet and was staring at the green man. "You're dead," Father said, in a shocked voice. "You're dead. Surely. You died at Summerhall. I remember seeing you in King's Landing when my father took me there to see King Aegon, but you died at Summerhall. Hoster Tully, is it not?" "Yes. I remember you. You gaped at me a great deal, and now you are Lord of the Riverlands." The old man seemed to straighten up. "I am now the Green Man, from the Isle of Faces, and as such, I claim the right to speak with you at once. The Green Men are no longer bound to the Isle. You need to know why." Father gaped, there could be no other word for it, and then nodded. "My solar," he muttered, "at once." Before they moved out from the altar and the place where he had killed the other, they had one more thing to do. The bodies of Jarek and Othor were carefully gathered and laid next to each other. Ser Jeremy stood over them, his expression somber. "They were good men," he said eventually. "They fell in a fight against our oldest enemy. Remember them, and now their watch is over." "And now their watch is over," Ed muttered in chorus with the rest of them. Then he stared at the two bodies. Were Othor's eyes always that color? "They look blue." "He always had blue eyes," Tywin muttered. "Didn't he? A fine lot of rangers you lot are, eagle-eyed and watching every leaf flutter on the wind." Ser Jeremy muttered, then he sighed. "Right on, brothers. Blue-eyed or not, we cannot take a chance with the bodies of our late brothers. I will take care of them." Ed looked at him sorrowfully. "No, Ser Jeremy. We will help you. It should not be your burden alone." "I am in charge, Tollett. It's my responsibility." He drew his sword. "Ride on, as I said." They did, with Tywin holding the baby in a small nest of a fur cloak that once been Othor's. No sense in wasting what had belonged to a now dead man. And after some minutes, Ser Jeremy joined them, riding hard and with a grim look on his face. "Should I die north of the wall, I want you to do the same to me," he told them as they rode south. "I want to die clean and not come back as a white." Craster had had a lead on them, but then he was on foot and they were mounted, so that lead was soon eaten up. Even then they caught up to him as he approached the gates to his keep, that low ring fort in the forest. The wretched man heard them approach and wheeled to face them, his hand on the hilt of his sword and a look of surprise on his face. When he saw Ser Jeremy and the others, an odd look crossed his face, like a combination of annoyance and a sudden need to stop showing any emotion at all. "Ser Jeremy," Krister called out as a farther look crossed his face. One of greasy unctuousness. "Are the rangers abroad again? You and your men have been quiet of late." "Aye, we have been abroad again," Ser Jeremy grated through gritted teeth as he dismounted. "We have been seeing much here, north of the wall, much indeed. The wildlings, those you call the free folk, are moving south, through the wall. They claim that they have seen the others." A new expression crossed the face of Craster, this time one of false bafflement. "The others. Ser Jeremy." He looked over his shoulder for a moment at the gates to his keep. "But they are but a legend." Ed set his jaw a little. The man could have had "I am a liar" branded on his forehead, and then the babe in the arms of Dwan decided that he needed to make a contribution, because he raised his voice in a thin wail that probably meant that he was hungry. The impact the babe had on Craster was immediate. The big man turned as white as milk and stared at Tywin. "That noise? A babe? Where did you get him?" "You know full well. The altar where you left him," Ser Jeremy snarled. "Your own son, you heartless cunt. Your own son." The wildling took a horrified and tottering step forwards. "No, you must take him back. You fools, you don't know what you've done." "What stopped you from sacrificing your own son to the others?" Ed spat. "Your own son, you bastard." "I had no choice," Krister roared. "No choice. I give them the boys, and they leave me alone. Me and my wives. Now, give him back. Take him back." "Too late, Krister," Ser Jeremy said grimly. "Too late. The other who came for your son is dead." Craster looked at him as if he was mad. "Dead? Impossible. You can't kill another. They are invincible. Immortal. They are creatures of ice and shadow. Take him back." "No," Ser Jeremy said, in a voice like stone. "We will not." Another came. "We killed it. Tool it. There slew it. They can die. We all saw it." But Krister was not in the mood to hear such things. He let out a wail of terror and darted towards Tywin, only to be met and pushed back by Ser Jeremy. "You will not have that, babe," Ser Jeremy roared. "You will not." That brought him a snarl of defiance. The wilding reached for his sword, but met Ser Jeremy's knife, which slammed into his guts. There was a long pause as Krister gasped for air, for a long moment, as various liquids splattered on the ground underneath him, and then Ser Jeremy twisted the knife inside him, and Krister shuddered for a long moment, and then finally collapsed, the life in his eyes vanishing. Ser Jeremy stood over the prone body of the wildling, panting for a long moment. And then he wiped his knife on the body and looked at the holdfast above them, where Ed could see that a group of women were now staring down at them, all in what appeared to be a combination of horror and relief. "Gwen, walk forwards. Find out who that babe belonged to," Ser Jeremy muttered as he checked the still body of Krister, peering into those lifeless eyes. Eyes seemed normal. Tywin dismounted and then strode forwards, holding the babe up so that the huddle of women could see him. "We found him north of here, in the forest. He was to be a sacrifice. We've come to return him." There was a shocked pause, and then one of the women rather timidly came forwards. With every step she seemed to grow bolder and bolder, until she eventually darted forwards and peered at the babe, before bursting into tears. "He's mine," she sobbed, as she took him from a rather relieved Tywin. "My baby boy. I'm finally holding him. He took him away. You brought him back. I finally have my little boy back." And then she cried on Tywin's shoulder, making him look extremely uncomfortable again. In the meantime, the other women had also come forwards. They varied in age, with one of the younger showing every sign of being pregnant. The oldest of them looked down at Krister's body, and then she hawked and spat at it. "About damn time someone put him out of our misery," she grunted, before looking at them all warily. "You know why he was talking the baby boys then?" "A sacrifice for the others," Ed muttered, still feeling the horror that such words meant. "The man was mad. He thought that the babes would keep them away," the older woman replied, her face working slightly with some indefinable emotion. "Everyone else was moving south, following Raider, heading to the wall. He said no, said that we were safe here, as long as we placated them. By sacrificing your sons," Ser Jeremy said quietly. She looked at him and then a look of utter anguish crossed her face. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes. Krister gave my sons away. All of our sons." Ser Jeremy nodded slowly, but it was Ed who said what the older man was obviously thinking. "You can't stay here." "No," she muttered. Then she straightened. "My name is Jen. I have cousins out there in the world, with the free folk. We'll leave here at once to join them. If you need supplies, take whatever you need from here at once. We're leaving this place as soon as we can, and when we leave I'm throwing a burning brand into the hall so that it burns to the ground behind us." And then she spat bitterly on Krister's body again before bustling into the hold, shouting orders to her sister wives. I'd watched her go, and then shrugged. "Permission to make sure that this bastard never walks after us." "Ser Jeremy?" "Aye," came the reply. "Hack his head off." He had dismounted and then drew his sword. This was something that he was going to get quite a bit of pleasure out of. Jorah, the king kept surprising him. He was not the single-minded buffoon that so many people thought that he was. Or perhaps he had made people think that he still wasn't sure. There were times when the king could be very astute, and other times when he seemed to be clueless. "There's more to him than meets the eye," Lara had told him the other night, her head on his chest after making love and then chatting drowsily about the events of the day. "He's like lightning in the clouds, hidden until you see it, feel it, hear it." It was an apt description, he thought, as he watched the crowd of people bustling around in the new castle. They would be leaving the next morning for Winterfell. The king had wanted to leave 2 days before, but there had been too much to do. The realm was being run by Raven, to King's Landing. Oh, and the queen had tried to get a wheelhouse made for the royal family. It had been ludicrously impractical and had been ruthlessly squashed by the king. Actually, he'd just stared at it, looked pointedly at the wheels, and then laughed so hard that tears had run down his face, before turning and walking away, shaking his head. "Won't last a mile on that road without losing a wheel," he'd rumbled. "Too thin." Which is why Jorah treated bouts of swordplay like the one he was about to undergo, with not a little trepidation. He was in a shirt and breeches, with an old pair of boots on his feet and his usual sword in his hand. Opposite him stood the king, with Sir Barristan Selmy to one side, his eyes intent. Robert Baratheon was stripped to the waist and was holding Stormbreaker. That was something else. The king seemed to be getting fitter by the way, or at least he was driving himself to be so. He seemed to be everywhere, walking, talking, lifting logs onto his shoulders, riding out for hunts in the nearby forest, and above else, he was sparring. Jorah took a step to one side, matching the king, and then the bigger man swung. No warning, no flicker of the eye, no twitch of the sword, just a lunge. Jorah parried it with a grunt, and then returned the favor with a slash of his own, which Stormbreaker met. He took a step back and then launched his own attack, something he'd picked up off Loros, a Dothraki move that required him to feint, not once but twice, in an effort to get the king off balance. He almost succeeded, but the king wasn't fooled, although he did smile hugely at him as they went back to that slow circling. Not bad, Mormont. An SLC move? Dothraki, your grace. Here's something from the Stormlands. And with that he unleashed another attack, a series of hard-lugging slashes that got Jorah darting backwards and repressing more than a few swear words. Damn, but the man was strong, especially when he delivered an overhead blow that Jorah barely held at bay with his own sword. And he was getting faster. An overhead blow like that could make him vulnerable to a quicker man with a blade, but he managed to pull it off with an impressive swiftness. Another Dothraki move came to mid again, and he feinted not once, not twice, but 3 times, followed by swapping his sword from his right hand to his left, and then lunging. This almost worked. The king actually swore for a second, but then he got his sword down in time and parried the blow. And then the king counterattacked, with a string of hard and heavy slashes that Jorah could barely parry. Forced onto the back foot, he transferred his sword back to his right hand, and then parried blow after blow, and then the king unleashed a really heavy blow that jarred Jorah's sword out of his hand. And Sir Barristan roared, "Bow to his grace." There was a moment of silence, and then the king lowered Stormbreaker, and roared with laughter. "Well fought, Mormont. Well fought indeed. You almost had me at that last trick of yours. Dothraki again?" "Aye, your grace," Jorah panted as he retrieved his sword and then sheathed it. "Didn't work, though. Something to remember, though. Another lesson. Need to learn as much as I can, if I'm to use this sword of mine as well as I can." The king sighed for a long moment. "Warhammer's one thing. A sword like this is something else." "Your grace is getting better with every day," Sir Barristan said, and Jorah knew that he was not being an arse-kisser. It wasn't in him to be like that, but there is still much to learn. "There's always much to learn," King Robert rumbled as he pulled his shirt on. "Do you stop learning is the day you face the wall, and die." Now that did not sound like the Robert Baratheon he'd heard about. Odd. He swapped a slightly surprised look with Sir Barristan, who looked thoughtful, and then shrugged internally. Boots rang to one side, and Sarah Preston Greenfield emerged from a gateway, bowing as he saw the king. "Your pardon, your grace, but you asked to be informed when the ship bearing your brother Lord Stannis was in sight. It has been seen at the headland, beating up towards the city." "Good. He made a fast passage then," the king boomed. "Should be interesting to hear how a godswood came to be found at Dragonstone." "Aye, your grace," Sir Barristan nodded. "I am keen to hear that too. I spent a lot of time on that island, and I never heard of a godswood." The king nodded at him, an odd look on his face. "You were there with Rhaegar Targaryen, were you not?" "I was, your grace." He once read in an ancient parchment some mention of there having once been a godswood on Dragonstone, but no matter where we looked, we never found it. He concluded that it must have been destroyed when the Valyrians conquered the island and built the castle there. "A fair assumption," Jorah muttered. The thought of no weirwood south of the neck had always disturbed him. He'd gotten used to it, in Essos, because it was abroad. The first men were everywhere, even Dragonstone. Another odd look crossed the king's face. "It's starting to occur to me that they left behind warnings that should have been heeded." Then he looked at Jorah. "We'll be on the road to Winterfell tomorrow. My pardon for you holds all over the realm. But I know that the north contains a lot of stubborn buggers. You'll need to talk to Lord Stark, will you not?" A cold, hard knot materialized in the pit of his stomach for a moment. I was planning to. Bear Island. Well, my old home is closed to me. I doubt that my aunt would welcome me." "Travel with us then." Bring your wife with you, he sighed. She's not my wife. Your Grace? Not yet, the king rumbled as he strode off. Not yet. He watched him go, trailed by the 2 king's guards. He'd never thought about that. Perhaps he should. Gendry. He might just be getting used to sea travel. At least he'd stop turning green whenever the ship swooped into a trough. It helped that the seas had quietened a bit and that Devon Seaworth was steering the ship again. But he might just be getting used to sea travel. Just in time for the trip to end. He stared up at the headlands ahead and shivered a bit. The north. He'd made it to the north. Apparently he'd need thicker clothes, and it wasn't even winter yet. Life had been well. There were times when he felt as if he'd been left for too long in the forge and then hammered flat one way before being twisted the other way. And speaking of hammers, he looked at the head of the warhammer that projected slightly over one shoulder. He'd made a harness for it. Probably needed to find a name for it as well. At least he was getting used to it now. Lord Stannis. Strictly speaking, he was his uncle, which was so strange he'd never had an uncle before, had been training him with it every day, making every muscle in his arms twang with tiredness at times. He'd spent so long making things out of metal that he still had trouble thinking that his life might now consist of hitting people with a different kind of hammer. And that was quite likely now. Lord Stannis emerged from his cabin to one side and then strode over to him. White Harbor, he said tersely. The only real city in the north. Remember what I told you. Aye, my lord, Gendry muttered. Avoid the notice of the queen and her brother. Stay away from any man in Lancel livery, and avoid Prince Joffrey. Yes, Lord Stannis muttered, before placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. The boy would not welcome you. You resemble your father too much, and Joffrey, well, there is something wrong with that boy. Shireen hates him. He peered at his uncle. She's a very good judge of character, my lord. A small smile crossed the older man's face, like a cloud flashing across the face of the moon. She's a wise girl, he said eventually. Rids a lot. Smiles more too these days, said the Lady Saris, from behind them. I've seen her smile more on this voyage than over the past few months. The grayscale scars made people stare at her, and now that they are gone, my daughter smiles again. Gendry nodded respectfully at the wife of Lord Stannis. She was one of the most severe women he had ever met. All hard planes and severe lines. He wasn't sure that she approved of his existence, although she did seem to be very slowly thawing, ever so slightly. But the words she had just spoken were a step forwards, and hinted at a slight approval of his existence. And then Shireen darted out of her own cabin and ran towards them. White Harbor? Oh, it's so pretty. The light on the walls. She was excited, and yes, she was smiling a lot. When he had first met the girl, she had worn her hair long, like curtains, that hid her grayscale. The curtains were now gone. Instead, she had pulled her hair back into double braids that were tied together at the back, showing off the area where the grayscale had once been, but was no longer. As they approached the quay, the crew thundered around them to the sound of Devon Seaworth's commands. There were times when he sounded like a younger version of his father. But it was the hulking figure standing on the quay side that caught his eye. His father, the king, he seemed, well, he looked as if he was thinner than before, whilst being a little larger about the shoulders. Robert's not fat anymore, Lord Stannis half muttered to himself. What in the name of the gods is going on? What's happened to the man? As the ship was moored and the gangplank set in place, Lord Stannis led his family down to it, with a wary Gendry lagging behind. The king strode up to his brother first, and then clasped arms with him. He almost loomed over him, and Lord Stannis was not a small man. The king then stepped to one side and greeted Lady Salis, speaking softly and kissing her hand, something that seemed to startle her slightly, and then he stepped up to Shireen. As he did, he went down onto one knee and peered at her, before smiling broadly.
Welcome to White Harbor, niece,
the king rumbled, still smiling. There's so much to show you here. And you are just the person to read about, and tell me what I should have seen from the start here. Will you help me? It was exactly the right thing to say, because she flushed a little and then nodded, curtsied. And then he kissed her on the cheek, and she flung her arms around his neck. She could just about hear her when she muttered, Uncle Robert, my grayscale is all gone. Aye, and you are now the prettiest thing here in White Harbor. They broke apart, him still beaming at her, and then he looked at Gendry. And here's the lad who found the godswood. He flushed and scuffed his boots on the wooden boards beneath his feet. Didn't mean to, your grace. 'Twas an accident, but a happy accident. The king smiled at him and then pointed at the warhammer. Stanny's training you in that. Aye, your grace. He had to be formal. There were 2 Kingsguards behind his father, men wearing helms that almost seemed reptilian. Good. You'll need it. Come, all of you. I want to hear the tale. And with that the king swept them all up the hill towards the castle that stood there. But as he rode, he could feel the eyes on him. This place might be dangerous. Tristan! He was in the middle of a rather intriguing little tome about the history of navigation in the smoking sea that had emerged from the Summer Isles of all places, when someone very loudly cleared their throat to one side. Go away, he said crossly as he turned the page and made a note. I'm busy. No, said a familiar voice. I can't. He looked up. Marin, he said, surprised. What do you want? You are needed. Pah! Not another meeting. Youngwood's face is right. His calculations are exact. A long winter is coming. Send out the White Ravens, and have done with it. You are needed at the High Tower. Lord Hightower himself has requested you. He put his pen down and then stared at his old friend. I beg your pardon? Lord Hightower has requested your presence at the High Tower. Why? The message did not say, just that you are needed there. Again, why? Marwyn glared at him. I am not a reader of minds, so I do not know. He looked at the book again and sighed before putting it down. When does he need to see me? At once. Of course. Naturally. It isn't as if I have my own work to do. Bah. Very well. Is there at least a boat waiting? There is. Then it seems that I must take a trip. He stood and placed the book carefully away in his desk. Damn it. I had more books to read. There was indeed a boat, a barge with the personal sigil of Lord Leyden Hightower on it, and commanded by an impatient young fellow with the walk of a man built for boats and not land. He certainly knew his oars, because he commanded the crew to push off and then start rowing with a crisp snap and pull of the oars that sent the boat downstream towards the harbor and the great tower that sat within it. Some signal must have been sent, or perhaps someone with a marish eyeglass had been watching for him, but when he reached the jetty by the main entrance, Lord Leyden Hightower himself was waiting there. My Lord Hightower, Piristan said with a bow, you sent for me. How may I serve you? The Lord of Old Town looked him up and down and sniffed. He had not left the Hightower for years, but he seemed much the same, if a little whiter of hair and beard. Archmaester, he said. I am told that you are an expert on history and specifically the history of the Reach. I have some small knowledge of it, he said cautiously. Something was happening here. There was an odd tension in the air. The guards looked tense. Do you have a particular question about it that required my presence? Lord Hightower smiled, a very brief smile. It has long been my opinion that if you ever tell a maester that something extraordinary exists, he will either deny it or ask you a series of questions, or sometimes even just stand there and go off into a brown study. So I will merely tell you to follow me. And off he strode, at a surprisingly fast pace for a man of his years. Along through the main gates into the High Tower itself, along corridors that bore the subtle signs of the work of the first men, and then down a set of stairs. As they walked down them, the windows were replaced by torches. Down they went into another corridor, and then, along it, and into another stairwell, one that wound down in a tight spiral. When that ended in another corridor, there was a young man there with a set of lanterns of the Citadel's own making, lanterns that shed a lot of light. And then they walked to another staircase. When that one ended, Kiristan blinked. The walls had changed. They were now black. This must be the original black stone foundation of the High Tower. He looked at the stone and shuddered slightly. It seemed to almost glisten in the lamplight, as if it was somehow greasy. There was no decoration on it, not carving, just black stone. And no one knew who had built it. Down again, Lord Hightower said. We are not yet there. And off he went again, striding off down the corridor, and then down yet another bloody staircase. This one was different. The steps were a little smaller, and he had to concentrate on where he placed his feet. Down they went, deeper and deeper, and after a while, he realized something. We are below the harbor now, surely. We are, came the grim reply. Far below now. I did not know that the High Tower went so deep. Few do. Surely the Citadel knows. One Archmaester once did. Who? Berwyn? I am not familiar with that name. You should not be. He died 500 years ago, and his name was stricken from the rolls of the maesters. Why? He went mad, and then they went on, deeper into the far depths of the high tower, until eventually the black staircase came to an end. They paused there, which was a blessing on his knees, and then he felt something start to steal over him, a vague uneasiness. Lord Hightower looked at him. You feel it then? Feel what? That sensation that something is wrong somewhere. He paused. Yes, but then I live in the Citadel. Normally some experiment or other is going wrong somewhere in the place. But yes, I do feel something. What is it? Lord Hightower smiled slightly again, and then crooked a finger. Come. They passed along a long corridor that curved slightly, and then he saw light ahead of them. It was a doorway, with torches and lanterns burning there. There were 2 guards there, and as they approached he could see that they were very nervous, with sweat rolling down their faces. You are relieved, Lord Hightower told them. Go back to the barracks. My thanks. The 2 guards bowed and then all but ran down the corridor, replaced by the pale-faced guards that had followed Periston and Hightower. We limit guards to shifts of 2 hours every other day, said Hightower sadly, as he unlocked the door with a great iron key. Any more and, well, they run. He opened the gate and stepped through, beckoning for Periston to follow. After he stepped through, he locked it behind them, and then walked on. Lord Hightower, Preston muttered as they walked, this is all most intriguing, but, and then he paused. They were in what seemed to be a great room, and at the far end of that room was an even greater gate. It was twice, no, thrice as high as he was tall, and at least twice that wide. And it glowed. It was a sickly green color, and it made him uneasy beyond words just looking at it. What? He said eventually. What is that thing? The reason why the high towers have always stayed here. It is our burden. We were told to guard it. Whatever it took, we had to guard it. The arrival of the Andals. We coped. The Targaryens, we bent the knee, we stayed here and we guarded it. It was my task to look upon it once a year. He peered at it, as that feeling that something somewhere was very wrong intensified. The Citadel does not know that this even exists, does it? No, they would ask too many questions. Silly questions at that. Then why are you showing it to me? Because it has changed. Because there are runes on it that can now be seen that I did not know even existed. Because it now glows, when once it did not, and because that damn thing is bolted against something. I would like to know what. He took a step forwards, hesitant, and frowned. The feeling of wrongness had deepened. There is another reason. And what is that? Take a step closer, if you can, and listen. He did so, his stomach roiling yet again. The hairs on the back of his neck seemed to be trying to rip their way off his skin, and then he heard it. Something seemed to be pounding something far beyond the other side of the gate, and there was a noise, like a slow groan, as if a wind was blowing. What is that noise? I don't know. Is there someone behind this gate? If there is, then I don't know who they are. Don't try and get closer to the gate. Why? Fear. He looked back at the other man, and then took a tentative step forwards. The feeling of fear strengthened a bit. Another step. The fear became terror. Another step. Bladder control was now a problem. And then he strode quickly back to the other man, and swallowed. It would seem that I have some research to do, Lord Hightower. Ned. He looked out at the mass of people in the hall, and smiled slightly. A lot of quiet business was being done at Castle Black. Getting so many lords and even ladies together meant that negotiations and arrangements, and yes, even disputes that would normally take a lot of time and effort, and ravens were being sorted out relatively quickly, and he'd only had to arbitrate loudly once. Ned, I need a word. Gerald Mormont muttered to one side, and he slipped away from his chair and walked into the other room, with the big man. Mose is on her way now. Needs to talk with us. He nodded and then paused. The Lord Commander had an odd expression on his face. Everything all right? Gerard pulled a slight face. First time I've seen her since I volunteered to take the black. After Gerard disgraced himself and sent me a string of ravens asking what kind of an upbringing I'd given the bloody fool. Speaking of Jorah, you know of his pardon? The old bear scowled a little. I heard he was working for Crown or spying for it in Essos. Did enough of that to earn a pardon. He then sniffed in a manner that gave Ned little doubt that he did not approve of that. Aye, Ned nodded, before pulling a slight face himself. The pardon came from Robert himself. He's free to return to Essos, and he was last seen with the company of the Rose. There's word that they have sought passage back to the north. The old bear's eyebrows went up like a pair of startled crows. The company of the Rose, the descendants of those who would not bend a knee to the Targaryens. Aye, the call was heard in Essos. Tierra Mormont ran his hand over his beard, thoughtfully. Ned, our ancestors must have been powerfully scared of the others. Aye. He walked to the window and peered up at the wall. Just a bit. He looked back at the Lord Commander. Anyway, if Jorah does return, I'll want a word with him. What if he comes to the wall to fight? I'll have a word with him myself. Jorah, I rumbled, before holding up his sheathed sword. I'm glad that Maggie is here for another reason. I'll give her this. For Daisy. Now it was Ned's turn to send his eyebrows flying upwards. You're giving Longclaw to Daisy. Aye. The older man looked down at the sword, with a combination of pride and loss. Jorah had enough honor in him to send this to me when you stripped him of his titles for his crimes and he fled into exile. That was the hardest thing I've had to do for some time. Ned said softly. I knew that you'd take it hard. You did the right thing. A crime like that. Well, no matter how many pardons Robert Baratheon sends him, this sword will never be his again. He shamed the family. Shamed me. Longclaw belongs with Daisy. She'll be Lady of Bear Island one day. She'll need a good sword. A fist thumped at the door. Come, Ned called. The door opened to reveal Maid Mormont, a short, stout woman with gray hair and a look of intent willfulness. She was dressed in chainmail, with a bearskin cloak, and a mace was slung from her belt. Behind her strode two of her daughters. Daisy was dark-haired, lanky, tall, and also had a mace, whilst Elisane was more like their mother, short and stocky, although she bore a sword. As they came to a halt, they all went down to one knee, before Ned. Lord Stark, the Stark in Winterfell. House Mormont stands ready against the long night. Command us, Meg, he barked, and Ned could hear her brother grunt to signal his approval of her words. Thank you, Lady Mormont, he replied before smiling. Oh, get up, you old she-bear. Stop dusting your brother's floor. Magich cackled with laughter and then stood with a grunt, before embracing Ned in a bear hug that almost broke a rib or three. Ned, good to see you again, and you too, you old bear. And with that, she repeated the process with her brother. Those eyes bulged slightly from the force of her embrace. The long night comes, Magga said eventually, as she stepped back. I never in my darkest nightmares think that I'd see the day. Aye, Ned muttered. You had news for us, though. I do, she muttered as she unrolled a map, and then placed it on the table. Odd things have been happening on the frozen shore. She placed a finger on the map, which showed the area north of Bear Island. Fishermen in the area have noted odd fogs and freezing mists there, on the shoreline for some time now, at least the past 2 months. There's a river that comes down from the western side of the Frostfangs, in the land of always winter. But what many don't know is that there's another river, one made of ice or a wall of it, a glacier, that comes south to the northwest of that. That spot, where the glacier meets the sea, is where the mists have been worst, and they freeze. I've talked to men and women who have seen sails start to stiffen with frost and ropes begin to freeze as they approached that mist, so much so that they turned around and sailed away from them. She looked at Ned and Joer. It must be the others. There can be no other explanation. Ned looked at the map and nodded slowly. Apparently Mance Rayder was given a warning about something happening to the west. Perhaps this is it. Do you think that Bear Island is in danger? I do, Mange said with a nod. Which is why we were late. The defenses of Bear Island have been strengthened. I don't know what might come, but we are ready. Given what we have heard, though, we will need dragon glass. Ned nodded slowly. Aye, you'll have it. Supplies have been coming in from the last hearth and also from Dragonstone, of all places. He looked back at the map. Something was nagging at him. Send word to Winterfell if you lack for anything at all. Maggie nodded slightly. Thank you, Ned. The door sounded from another knock, and he peered at it. Come. It opened to reveal Maester Aemon, who was holding messages. A message from your lady wife, Lord Stark, the Maester of Castle Black muttered as he handed it over. Ned unraveled it and read. Then he read it again. "It seems," he said in his level of voice as he could manage, "that some relatives of ours have arrived in White Harbor. The Company of the Rose has arrived there. They are led by a cousin of mine that I didn't know even existed." He looked at the assembled Mormonts. "There are also Mormonts amongst them. More than a few. Oh, and Jorah Mormont has traveled with them." Well, now, he finally knew what it was like to see flabbergasted members of the Mormont family. Tyrion, well, the view was certainly spectacular from up here. The top of the wall gave him the most amazing vista of, well, what appeared to be a good chunk of the north in one direction, and an equally good chunk of the land beyond the wall in the opposite direction. He joked to Uncle Kevin that he'd be able to take a piss off the top of the wall and be the tallest Lannister ever. Now that he was here, well, the jape was no longer funny. Part of the reason for that was that the wind was so cold up here that any prospective piss would freeze, along with an appendage that he was very fond of. The other reason was that the people below might not like it. He could see the campfires from there, all over the landscape. There were thousands of people out there. Men, women, children. Oh, and giants. He was still rather stunned by their very existence. He could see one now, at a distance. It was on a mammoth and was passing along a path through the forest, dragging some logs behind it. They were all running for their lives, running to the wall, to safety. He looked at the horizon, and his skin crawled. They were out there, somewhere. Pressing south all the times, killing those who were too slow, reanimating the dead. It was the most monstrous form of desecration that there was. The lift ground to a halt behind him, and he heard slow footsteps, along with a shivering sigh at the view. "They said you were up here," said Robb Stark. "Quite a view." "The land's beyond the wall," Tyrion said musingly. "In all its chilly beauty. I wanted to be able to tell my uncle that I'd been up here. I once joked to him that I would take a piss off the top. Have you?" "No." The joke lost its point after I saw the reality beyond the wall. All those poor bloody people, running for their lives. When will the gate open for them? "In a few hours, the lords of the north will have finished their deliberations by then. The gates to the west are already open, as is the one at Eastwatch by the sea." "You mean that your father and the old bear will have stopped shouting at them by then?" "Maybe. Maybe not. Not that much shouting will be required. Father just has to wave the fist of winter under some noses." There was a pause. "Seen enough up here?" "I am a little chilly." "Why?" "Time to plan our trip to the Night Fort." He looked to the east along the wall. "I wonder why we have to go there." There was a silence for a long moment. Our ancestors left warnings for us to heed. We failed them. Time for us to repair some of the damage. Whatever they left at the Night Fort. Whatever we need to do there, we'll find it and do what we need to do. The boy was such an optimist. And if we cannot, what if we cannot put it right? For some reason, this brought him a dry laugh. "Tyrion Lannister, you know nothing about what cannot be put right." It was an odd comment, but one that Robb Stark said with a deep sigh. The old gods have done, well, quite a lot. And those last words were said with an intensity that made Tyrion look at the lad carefully. "Of course things can be put right," he said jovially. "We must be cheerful, young Robb Stark. Why, we are going into a place of legend." But he had a funny feeling that Robb was referring to something else. "What though?" "Horus. If the north was nothing like the Reach, then the lands beyond the wall were nothing like the north. The cold was worse, the wind like a knife that cut you down to the very bone, if you were not wearing the right garments." He leant on the stanchion and looked ahead at the mist in front of them. The slow wind that was driving them into the shore was starting to shred the mist a little, and he peered at it carefully. Hardhome, a place of ill omen, but the place where they had to go to. He'd arrived at Eastwatch by the sea, with a small fleet of 5 ships sent by his father. Father had admittedly been in 2 minds over the whole thing. On the one hand, he'd known that Lord Tyrell would not approve. On the other, he knew that Lord Willis would approve, and Lord Willis was more important these days. The mist tore and ripped, and he found himself staring at, well, he wasn't sure quite what he was staring at. The remains of a settlement. Certainly, it was larger than anything that the lands beyond the wall was supposed to have. It was also, well, a blasted ruin. "No one's ever known what happened here," Cotter Pike said grimly as he stepped up next to him. "'Tis a place of ill omen. When was it destroyed?" It felt odd not adding a my lord or sir, but the fierce older man scorned anything like that. Although, to be fair, Pike did not really know what to call the volunteers that had arrived at the harbor of the castle. He commanded, "You lot" was one phrase, with bloody southerners being helpful, being another. 600 years ago, Pike muttered. Gone in a night. Someone or something burnt the place. No survivors, no one lived in it since. Horace looked ahead at the rough shacks that had been built in the ruins, and with the hasty repairs to some of the largest buildings, and then at the crowds of wildlings that were watching the approach of the ships. From the way that some of them were running and clutching spears, they would not get a warm welcome. "Should I negotiate with them?" he asked Pike. "They might not welcome a man of the Night's Watch." The old man spat something overboard. "Oh, they'll not welcome me. But they won't have a fucking clue what that bunch of grapes on your surcoat means, boy." He paused and then hoisted a spear with a pine tree branch on the end. "But they'll know what this means." Truce sign, and with that he started to wave it over his head. Horace couldn't exactly see any difference, but after a long moment Pike seemed to relax a little. "Well, we'll not get stuck full of arrows." That was not reassuring. What was also not reassuring was the large hulking figures on the southern edge of the bay, on even larger creatures. Giants. Pike grunted. More of them than I've ever seen of them in one place before. Interesting. They transferred into a large skiff that was sculled in with sure crisp strokes, that Pike muttered. Weren't too bad. For soft southerners as they made for the remains of a jetty. Horace eyed it uncertainly as they approached it, but it seemed to be just about sturdy enough to take them. Like everything else there, it had been repaired at various times over the years, or that at least was what it looked like. Night's Watch comes here sometimes. Trying to puzzle out what happened, Pike said out of the corner of his mouth, as he heaved himself up onto the jetty. Makes sense to repair this thing. Horace followed the older man up and then looked at the patchworked surface. It looked as if random bits of wood had been hammered into it. And then he followed Pike, who was still carrying the spear with the pine branch attached to it, along it. Much to his surprise, neither of them fell through it. As they reached the end, they were approached by a group of wildlings, ranging in age from his age to, well, bloody ancient. 2 wildlings led them, one dressed in what appeared to be a lot of mismatched furs, and the other, well, she was dressed in slightly better furs, and she was definitely a woman. "Spearwife?" Pike muttered. "Don't stare." "What do you want, Crow?" The wildling man called the words roughly. "If you are a crow, that is. Our people still tell tales of the last slavers we caught near here. From Essos, they were from, but they never saw their homes again. We killed them all and burnt their ship. I'm Cotter Pike from Eastwatch by the Sea. Word came from Castle Black that you would be here. Mance Rayder has negotiated a truce with the Lord Commander. We know what chases you, what hunts you." The wildlings paused and muttered amongst themselves. Some of the older wildlings looked a bit shifty and unconvinced, but the spear wife set her head a little, pulled her hood down, and then stepped forwards. Who else spoke with Castle Black? "One Rattleshirt, or the Lord of Bones," Pike replied. The wildlings stared at them, and then she nodded. "Casse," she said eventually. "Beg pardon?" Horace asked. The wildling transferred the stare to him. "Name," she said, eventually. "Carse, and who or what might you be?" "Horace Redwine, from the Arbor," he said with a touch of defiance. "In the Reach." "The Reach of what?" He looked at Pike, who seemed to be trying not to smirk. "It's one of the 7 kingdoms, in the south." She raised both eyebrows at him, and then turned back to Pike. "So if there is a truce, then why are you here?" "To take you south, we can ferry your people south of the wall." Pike seemed to almost spit the words out. The wildling women peered at him. "You sound unhappy about that, Crow." "I was brought up not trusting wildlings." Pike sighed. "But I have orders from Castle Black. Your king has asked that you be taken to the gift and the Lord Commander has agreed to it. So has Lord Stark." There was a susurration amidst some of the wildlings at that, but why that was so, Horace did not know. "South, to the gift?" Carse asked. "All of us?" "Aye. The gates at the castles are opening, but it's been pointed out that there are a lot of you, so that's why we're here. You can ship the lot of us south on those things." The older wildling pointed at the ships in the bay. "How will you get us out there?" "Boats in the case of the larger ones. For the smaller ones we can use this jetty. But it will need to be extended. We need tree trunks hammered into the sea at the end. and then more logs laid out to them. I have men who can do the work. We just need the wood. The wildlings glared at the jetty, and then at them. I'll ask the giants, Carsey said eventually, almost in disgust at the reticence of the others. They're only here for a day or so more. They can't take their mammoths onto those ships. Mammoths? Horace asked, his skin crawling a bit. Truly. Carsey just looked at him, and then stalked off, muttering. When she was amongst the crowd, her voice could be heard shouting in what sounded like several languages. The other wildling leaders at the jetty also watched her go, and then muttered to themselves. After a while, the older one stepped forwards again. I am Lankin, he said gruffly. We will go with you. There is nothing for us here but death, and then he scowled at them. But should you betray us, or we even hear a sniff of Westeros, we'll kill you all. Pike stared back at him. I am no slaver, he spat. We take you south for one reason, and one reason only. The others come, and we have no wish you see your corpses join the ranks of their army of whites. The wall is our only defense. We would not see it fall to a tidal wave of wildling whites. There was a bristling moment of tension, and then the wildlings nodded very slightly, and with evident reluctance, before turning and adding their voices to the hubbub. Pike watched them go, with a sigh, and then looked back at Horace. Well, that went better than it might have. Then he looked about. We need to find one of them that knows something about these caves and the white cages, or remains of them that they might hold. Horace looked at the caves that were set into the cliffs to one side and shivered more than a bit. They looked almost ghostly. Black and empty holes in the rock, some of which had paths carved into the rock leading to them. He nodded, and then joined Pike in stamping carefully on the solid parts of the jetty. By the time that the first of the boats had started to come ashore, a line of wildlings had formed up at the shoreline. It was the first time that he had seen what wildlings were like, truly like, and he watched with no small amount of, sympathy. They carried in age from babes to old men and women. All had the marks of hunger and no small amount of desperation on their faces. And their weapons, some had spears with stone tips. Some had scraps of metal at the end of their spears. Others had swords of rust or axes of what might have been bronze. Then he heard a noise, like nothing he could imagine, and then watched as 4 huge figures dressed in furs strode past him. They were carrying tree trunks over their shoulders, giants. He was really looking at giants. Hobber would never believe him. The giants walked over to the jetty, and after a moment of shock, Pike started shouting orders to them. They listened to him, looked at each other, shrugged, and then placed the tree trunks as he directed, driving them into the sand and mud beneath the sea, with smacks from their huge fists. Other giants brought yet more trees, and then wildlings were there, with planks stripped from buildings, and after a while the jetty started to get a lot longer and sturdier. Pike waved to some of the larger ships, which started to nose cautiously into the bay. As he watched all this, Horace noticed that Carsey had reappeared and was watching it all with a combination of a scowl and a smile. After a moment, she seemed to notice him. We're running, she said shortly. I wish that we weren't. He nodded somberly. He could see why. Then he pointed at the caves. I need to get into the caves. Why? She said the word with total horror in her voice. They are haunted. Cursed. Horace held up a placatory hand. Word came from Mance Raider, through this rattle shirt, that cages, or the remains of them, had been found there. We need to find them. Cages. Square things, about yay tall, with bars, he told her, gesturing the size with his hands. They are used to store the hands of whites, to preserve them, so that those to the south, where the weather is a lot hotter, can see that they exist. She eyed him as if he was raving mad. Then she jerked her head at the caves. Go and search then, Redwine. We will not stop you. We are not the mad ones, to enter such caves. And so off he went, with a sigh and a wince. 5 of his men went with him, and he sent 3 of them off to the cave next to the one that he entered first, kindling torches from bits of wood and the tar in the jars that they had brought with them. The first cave made him sick to his stomach and deeply thoughtful. It was blackened as if some great fire had seared it from inside out. Blackened bones were strewn everywhere. People had sought refuge there, and had died there. There were no cages or the remains of cages, but there were odd gouges in the mouth of the cave, as if some gigantic hand had clawed at it. The second cave was the same, and the third and fourth. Horus left the last one on that level with a sigh and then looked at the next level up, which held the largest cave. "The way is shut," he muttered, quoting part of a ghost tale that father had once told Hobber and himself when they were children. "It was made by those who were dead, and the dead keep it. The way is shut." Up the path he went, and as he reached the mouth of the cave, he looked back at the bay. The ships were filling fast now, and he could see the second squadron already. The slower ones that had already been at Eastwatch by the sea when his own ships had arrived there. There had to be another entrance to this place somewhere, because he could hear an eerie wind keening somewhere deep inside it. He winced, suppressed the memories of father's bloody tales, and walked in. More blackness, more odd gouges, and more shattered bones. And then he looked to one side. There was an unburnt section of the cave, and the sight of alcoves carved into the rock caught his eye. Striding over to it with one of his men, he peered at the alcoves. Yes, he reached forwards and pulled out a battered metal cage. It seemed to be half melted, but he finally grinned and called for the bag. Into it went the cage, and then the 3 more that followed it, all in a similar shape. "They can't all be melted," he muttered as he passed the torch around the deeper part of the unburnt section. And then he saw it. A whole one. 2 of them, in fact, and he grinned at his men, who smiled back. Well, 2 of them did. Where was the 3rd? "Where's Edwin?" he asked. "He went further back in the cave, Seratorharis," came the reply, looking to see what caused the moaning noise. "Then he's a braver man than I am," Horus thought. "Find him," he sighed. "I'll not leave anyone behind in this place." On they went, deeper into the cave. It narrowed a bit, more odd gouges there, and then widened. And then they saw the light of a torch ahead. It came closer as they approached, and then all of a sudden, Edwin appeared. He appeared to be gibbering with terror. "Setter Horus, there's something in there, something terrible." "What did you see?" He stopped to the older man with a hand on his shoulder. "What did you see?" "A dragon." He froze. Then he cursed. Of course, what else could have burnt this place, in such a way, with so many killed before they could escape? And then he paused again. If there was a dragon in there, then why had it attacked the wildlings? "Describe it, Edwin. Describe what you saw." Edwin seemed to shake himself as he seemed to pull himself together. A giant had horns, great white claws everywhere. Claws all over the place. He frowned. White claws? Lots of white claws? That did not sound at all right. Was there one dragon or several? Then he steeled his nerves, his guts, and wherever the hell his balls had shriveled up into, and turned to face the depths of the cave. Before creeping down it. Down he went, his terrified men lagging a bit behind him, deeper and deeper into the cave. And then he froze. There was a flash of white in the darkness. He stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering at his ribs, and then he moved forwards a step. It was a huge white bone, and there was another to one side. He stepped up to it, and then he froze again. There was a head to his left, a giant head, with teeth, and a white skull. Relief flooded through him, and very nearly made him piss himself. He stepped up to the skull and peered at it. Leathery scraps of skin remained in places here and there, but it was definitely a skull. "Fetch Cotter Pike," he called back to the others. "It's a dead dragon. Dead for centuries." By the time that the commander of Eastwatch by the Sea arrived, Horus had been able to walk around the entire corpse. It puzzled him. It was not a huge creature. It had been no Balian. The Black Dread not based on the skull that he had seen in the Red Keep. No, it was a bit smaller, quite a bit smaller. But what dragon had ever escaped to north of the wall? Why had it come here to die? When he saw the light of the torches from the small group that arrived, thanked the gods that his men had been discreet, he turned to them. Cotter Pike and the others had stopped dead in their tracks and were gaping at the remains of the dragon. "Well, now we know what happened here, all those years ago," Horus quipped weakly. It wasn't much, but nervous laughter rippled from the group. Then he looked back. Tendons are mostly gone. I don't think that the others could turn this thing into a white. Pike shuddered at the thought of it. Well, pull it apart and sever any tendons you find. The maesters will be in a right taking at the thought of not laying eyes on this. Aye, Horus replied as he peered at the jumble of wing bones and more leathery scraps that hung down over the middle of the dragon. And then he saw the sparkle and shine of the clutch of eggs underneath. He was worrying a bit about taking Ghost and the other direwolves with them to the Night Fort. It wouldn't be dangerous. Not exactly, but Father and Frostfire would not be coming with them. He had too much to do at Castle Black. So far, the people going to the Night Fort were as eclectic a group as he could imagine. Himself, Robb, Tyrion Lannister, Alliser Thorne, a man who seemed to dislike him for no particular reason, a small group of men of the Night's Watch, and the king beyond the wall. Mance Rayder, and apparently someone called Thormund Giantsbane. The last two were due later that day, once the last of the Lords of the North were gone. Apparently some of the last of them were lingering a little to speak to Father. Father. He would always think of Eddard Stark as his father. He'd always been there for him, even if Lady Stark had not. Well, not until recently. She'd been tentatively kind, fumblingly supportive. In private, she had apologized and then gone off to the Septon to pray. He sighed and then knocked on the door to Maester Aemon's quarters. Hearing a barked come, he pushed the door open and then entered, closing the door behind him. You asked to see me, Maester Aemon. The Maester looked up from his books and smiled cheerfully at him. I did indeed, young John. I hear that you are preparing for your trip to the Night Fort. We leave tomorrow, at dawn. You should be there by noon or just after then, if this weather continues fair. He paused. I remember the last time I saw that place. It was a great castle once. A true fortress for the Night's Watch. He smiled slightly. Tyrion Lannister seems both excited and afraid of the place. He has every reason to be. One of his ancestors commanded there once and seems to have left something for him there. Jon frowned at him and the old man waved a hand in dismissal. You'll find out once you are there. Do not let your guard down there. Renegades have been known to make rest there on occasion. So there is danger there, then? The oldest living Targaryen smiled thinly. Why, there is danger everywhere, if you look hard enough, and you have more reasons than most to look over your shoulder. He sighed. I wish that this burden had not fallen to you, my boy. This burden of your real heritage. It does my heart good to see you, but I know that you will have to hide that heritage if you want to live. A great irony struck me this morning. There was a time when two members of our family would come together and talk of great and terrible things. The breeding of dragons, the politics of King's Landing, the future crushing of cities in Essos, war and war, and yet more war. And yet here we are, the last two men in our family, divided by many leagues from your aunt, talking of nothing more than survival. And yet it is right that we do so. You must live, my boy. Live and have no grandiose plans. You cannot afford it. His mind reeled. I don't think I'd ever even consider anything grandiose, he replied faintly. A quiet life is all I've ever wanted. Something flickered over Aemon's face. A combination of relief and sadness, leavened with shame. I wish that I had more to give you than mere words. I wish that I could give you something more meaningful than advice. A legacy of land or men or gold. I have none of those things. As it is, I have but two gifts for you. One will help protect you in the wars that are to come. The other is, well, it is something that you or your descendants might one day be able to use, so to speak. The old man stood and then walked over to a great chest, next to which was a far smaller and far dustier chest. He pulled out a key and worked on the lock to the larger chest. Tell me, young John, have you ever heard of a man called Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven? Jon thought back through the list of Targaryen kings and family members that Maester Luwin had once made him memorize. He was the bastard half-brother of Darien II.
Quite so,
Aemon said, as he threw the chest open with a surprising amount of vigor, before carefully searching through the contents. He was a rather remarkable man. He fought in the First Blackfire Rebellion, was hand of the king to first his nephew, Aerys I, and then to Maekar I. He paused, and a small and wintry smile fluttered on his lips. Maekar was my father, a stern man, but a good one. Anyway, when I became maester here at Castle Black, Bloodraven also joined, or rather was forced to join, the Night's Watch. He was a strange man. An albino for a start. He lost an eye fighting against Bittersteel in the First Blackfire Rebellion. But he was still a terror with a bow. Damn it, where did I leave it? Aha. The old maester turned around, holding a long object covered in cloth, before walking back to where Jon was waiting. Bloodraven was a great leader of men, and it was not long before he became Lord Commander. Some said that he was a sorcerer, but I just knew him as a friend and a great man. A man who knew the value of duty and commitment. He vanished one day in a solo, ranging beyond the wall, something that he was increasingly prone to do. But before he left, he entrusted me with this. And with that, he pulled the cloth back a little to reveal the hilt of a sword. He stared at it. The wavy crossguard, the flames on the pommel. This is Dark Sister, he whispered. This is a... He looked over his shoulder at the door. This is a Targaryen heirloom. It's just a sword, Aemon replied dryly. A sword made from Valyrian steel, but still just a sword, and a foreboding is upon me that you will need it. You leave tomorrow. I know Donald Nye the smith here. Well, by tomorrow it will have a new hilt and a new pommel, and it will be yours. Mr. Aemon, I cannot. It's not mine. It can't be mine. It is yours. Listen to me, Jon Stark. I told you before to let the boy Jon Snow die and become the man Jon Stark. This sword was made for one purpose, to kill. I am an old man who will die soon. I am 100 years old, my boy. This sword has lain in this chest for almost half my life. Take care of it, Bloodraven said. It's for whoever of our family that comes here next. You have come here. It's yours. Jon reached out with trembling hands and pulled it from the cloth, hefting it for a moment as he felt its weight. Then he pulled it slightly out of the black scabbard. Yes, it was Valyrian steel. Thank you, he whispered. This is beyond anything I imagined. Pass it on to your sons, Aemon said with a slight smile, before taking it back. It will be ready for you at dawn. Now, here's the other thing, something I have not laid eyes on since a very black day in our family's history. And with that he strode over to the small chest, which he picked up with an odd look on his face, almost a wince of distaste. Here. Jon took the chest with a frown. What is it? Another key appeared in Aemon's hands, this one far smaller than the last. He fiddled with the lock again, and then opened it. Jon peered inside, and then he felt the blood flee his face. Every Targaryen, well, male Targaryen, sometimes the females too, has a dragon's egg placed in their cradle, Maester Aemon said in that strange flat tone. That was placed in mine. It's real. Jon traced a finger over the iridescent swirls on the surface of the first real dragon's egg that he'd ever seen. Why give it to me? Why? There was a combination of smile and snarl on the face of the older man's face. Because of that terrible thing called tradition. Because it is your birthright. Because perhaps you can succeed where I failed and hatch it. Because I hate the very sight of the damn thing after the news came to me of the death of my beloved brother at Summerhall, and I want to be rid of it. Because it is time for me to let go of such things. It's better off with you than me. Better with a young man than an old one. Jon stared at the sword, and then the egg. Maester Aemon, great-great-granduncle. Aemon, these are not small bequests. They are great ones. But Aemon shook his head at that. They are both gifts and curses. Never forget that. But we are family, and I do not think that you will let me down in this. Now, I have some books over here about the Night Fort that you might find interesting. And with that he led Jon over to the table nearby. Tywin. He leafed through the long list of reports and other documents, made a few small notes in a ledger to one side and then carefully put away the quill and the little bottle of ink. Only then did he stand and walk over to the window. From here he could see the roses that she had planted so many years before. The old gardener tended to them most carefully. He'd known Joanna when she had been but a child, and the old man had been fond of her. And now, decades on, he took care of the roses that she had loved so much. He nodded a little. That was good. He wondered sometimes, with a slight sense of despair, what Joanna would have made of things these days. Well, for a start, she would have frowned at the general state of things. Jaime was still in that damn white cloak. Cersei was still a spoilt imbecile, and Tyrion was still the dwarf who had killed his mother. He knew that Joanna would have loved Tyrion even if he had been a dwarf. He knew that Tyrion was not at fault for the death of Joanna. He just couldn't help it. Every time he looked at the lad, he saw the reason why Joanna was not here, alive and well, fussing over those roses and grinning at him impishly. It was foolish of him and petty, but by all the gods he missed her every day. A part of him had died with her. He shook his head slightly and grimaced a tad, before returning to his books. It was a knock on the door that disturbed him from a particularly messy little squabble that was being waged on paper between two minor houses, who were fighting over a small scrap of land. Yes, he looked up to see Dacre standing at the doorway. He looked somewhat baffled. What's the matter, Dacre? My lord, there's a man here. He says that he needs to seek your permission to tend the stone garden. Tywin raised an eyebrow. Does this man have a name? Rickon, my lord. He claims to be from the Isle of Faces. For a moment the other eyebrow came up, before both went down into a scowl. The Isle of Faces, he said flatly. Impossible. That's what I said, my lord, but he claimed that it was the truth, and that there was an ancient agreement that one day the stone garden would be tended again. He leant back in his chair and did his best not to stare. Now that was indeed an old agreement, an ancient promise, one that very few knew about, and which it had always thought was nothing more than a family tale. Very well, let him in. Yes, my lord. Dacre strode off, and Tywin rubbed his upper lip with a finger for a moment. When Dacre returned, he was escorting a short and rather nondescript man dressed in dark green clothes and with a dark green cloak with a hood of some kind. He wore a cloak pin that looked like a silver antler, and he was carrying a small saddlebag. As soon as he laid eyes on Tywin, he bowed, although not as deeply as Dacre obviously thought was proper, given his scowl. Lord Lannister, I presume. I am, and you would be the man who claims to be from the Isle of Faces. I find that hard to believe. The Green Men do not leave their island. Until now, the Green Men are abroad again. Why? The man tilted his head slightly and looked at him. The cause was sent. It was heard all across the realm. On the Isle of Faces. Well, all I will say is that it was a day that I will never forget. The trees themselves spoke. He looked at Rickon carefully. He detected a touch of the Riverlands in his accent, but he was still unconvinced. Many have spoken of the call. The Green Men have been secluded on their island for centuries, and yet you say that you have broken your seclusion. A small smile crossed the other man's face. The Green Man said that you might be a bit hard to convince. Very well. Perhaps this will convince you. He reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a something small and silver, which he then placed on the desk in front of Tywin. The moment he laid eyes on it, he froze. It was half a medallion. There was exactly half a tree on it. I understand that when you were Hand of the King, many years ago, you were once sent a message from the Isle of Faces, that it still existed, that it spoke for those who worship the old gods south of the neck, and that one day it would send the other half of the medallion that was sent that day. Here is the other half. He remembered that day. Eris and he had laughed over the message at the time, but he'd kept the medallion. It was in a chest somewhere. Dacre said that you were asking permission to enter the stone garden. Why? To tend to the heart tree there. There is no heart tree, just a weirwood tree. Rickon just smiled in reply. May I have your permission to enter the stone garden then? It has been many centuries since a green man was here. You may enter it. He paused as unease ran through him. Yet again. Wait, you said that the Green Man had left the Isle of Faces? I did. Does this man have a name? He did once. He said that he will meet you again one day. Again? I have met him before. You have. You were a cupbearer at the time, at the court of Aegon Theth. Your pardon, Lord Lannister. I have much to do. And he bowed and left. Tywin stared at the space where the Green Man had been for a long time, his mind whirling like a leaf in the wind. He'd been young when he had been cupbearer. Very young. The Green Man apparently remembered him from that far-off and happy time, the time before Summerhall. The Green Man therefore had to be quite old. Who on earth could he be? And then he shivered as something else occurred to him. There was a Green Man in the stone garden, tending to the weirwood tree there. It was like something out of legend. Something was happening. Something was in the air. For a long moment he felt almost afraid. He was not in control of this matter. Ned, a fist thumped at the door and he sighed a little and then faced the door. He was not looking forwards to this. Come. The door opened to reveal Lord Ricewell and Lady Dustin. They both looked, well, uncomfortable. Barbara Dustin was not a young woman anymore, but she was still a fine-looking one. She was, as always, dressed in black to show that she still mourned well in Dustin. If there was one thing that he regretted from his time in the South, it was that he had been unable to bring back the bones of those who had fought with him at the Tower of Joy. Barbara Dustin was someone who would never be able to let go of that fact. Lord Ricewell, Lady Dustin, how may I help you? Roderick Ricewell looked at him and then glanced at his daughter. Barbara, he said meaningfully. Tell him." Barbara Dustin glared at her father a little, and then stepped forward slightly. Her cheeks were a little red, a sign of some emotion. "Lord Stark, there has been fog on the Barrows for some weeks now. Fog on the Long Barrow especially, and on Great Barrow. The small folk says that the dead are restless. They talk of their needing to be a Lord Dustin again." And with that she shot a look of pure anger at him. "I do not know what to do." The last words came as if they had been forced from her. Ned just looked at her as if she was raving mad. "Fog. Fog," Lord Ryswell said, in a low voice. "It stays to the barrows of the old Barrow Kings. It will not move, and it's been there since the call went out." Ned stared at the two of them. "And this is the first time that you have now told me." "No word went to Winterfell. No word of this came to me. Why?" Barbara Dustin had gone red in the face, whilst her father was as white as a sheet, but Ned knew why. Her hatred for him was still deep and raw, even after all these years. He had taken her husband south and never bothered to return his bones after his death. Worse, he was not Brandon. She had loved her brother fiercely. The fact that the Lord Paramount of the North was Eddard Stark and not Brandon Stark rankled. The fact that she was not married to the Lord Paramount of the North also rankled. He wanted to sigh and then pinch the bridge of his nose. He couldn't, however. Those two would view it as weakness. And according to Robb, when he had marched south, there had been a very small number of men from House Dustin. Barbary had been a thorn in his side for some time, much to his grief. This was something that he had been hoping to avoid. There was still no news about who Barbary had designated as her heir, as Willem and she had not had the time to have any children before his death. He eyed her carefully. He knew better than to ask what her maester thought of it. She did not like maesters, or grey rats, as she called them. "Are there any records of this ever happening before?" Her eyes darted around his face. "No, Lord Stark. But there is fog on the Barrows, and no one knows why." "Yes, Lord Stark. I will ask Maester Aemon here to search the records of Castle Black for any references to this, and send a raven to Winterfell. Certain records are there, left by my ancestors. Word of this should have come to me before, though, especially if this is tied to the call."
"I didn't think that—"
Barbary Dustin did not sound as if she was enjoying the words she was speaking. "Lady Dustin," Ned said gently. "The call went out for a reason. The others are coming for all of us, not just for Winterfell, for all of us. If anything unusual happens, then you need to tell me, to send word." "It's just fog," she hissed before seeming to collect herself. "But it won't move. And the small folk whisper about House Dustin being gone." He looked at her and then sighed. "Not entirely," he muttered. "You have heard of the return of the Company of the Rose." Father and daughter looked at each other, and then at him. "Aye," the word came from them both. "There are Dustins amongst them." Barbary Dustin's eyes went wide, and then they narrowed. "Dustins? Truly? Or so it seems. I will be meeting all of them. I will assess the truth of who they claim to be. Let me be clear about this. You are the Lady of Barrowtown, Lady Dustin. You are in charge of Barrowtown and you are sworn to House Stark. If these new Dustins can assist you and help you in this matter, then that is enough for me. But it must be resolved. We must know why there is fog on the Barrowtowns." A still red-faced Barbara Dustin nodded, and then she and her father strode out. Ned watched them leave, and then shook his head. Those two had long been a problem. Perhaps recent events might solve that problem. The hour that followed saw the last of the Lords of the North leave Castle Black, including the Greaton, Roose Bolton, and Howland Reed. "The last hearth will be sending more dragonglass to the wall," the Greaton boomed at him as he heaved himself into the saddle. "And I'll shout at my idiot son a bit. He's a good lad, but he's got cheese in his ears at times." And then he was gone, riding south with the others. And after another hour, the main gate of Castle Black groaned open, north of the wall. The first people through the gate were led by Mance Rayder. The king beyond the wall, or whatever he was these days, was wearing a cloak that might once have been black, but which was now a dark gray color, along with boots and a jerkin that spoke more of the north than beyond the wall. He led a horse on which was a brown-haired woman, younger than Rayder, dressed in a hooded cloak. Another woman followed, bundled up in a cloak and hood as well, this one with honey-colored hair, and after that in strode a large man with red hair, a red beard that you could lose a small dagger in, and a look of slightly hesitant confidence. Raider and the group walked up to Ned, who now had Jorah Mormont on his right, and Robb, Jon and Theon to his left, and nodded carefully. Lord Stark, Raider. The former man of the Night's Watch was about to open his mouth again, when all of a sudden he caught sight of Frostfire and fell silent. Ah, he said, before seeing the smaller direwolves. You Starks don't do things by halves, do you? Ned couldn't help the laugh that erupted from his mouth. No, he said eventually, we don't. We think that the old gods sent them, just as they spoke through me earlier. What? The red-headed man asked, in loud bemusement. Through you? Raider glared at his lieutenant for a moment. You'll have to pardon Tormund, his mouth operates without his brain giving permission at times. Oh. You should meet the Gretchen, but you should also see Maester Aemon. A throat was cleared to one side, and the old Maester paced forwards. It's good to see you again, Nance Raider. As you can see, well, so can I. Raider and this Tormund both stared, looking astonished. Your eyes you can see? Evidently, Maester Aemon said, thanks to the old gods and Lord Stark, and may I ask who your other companions are? Raider visibly composed himself, before helping the brown-haired woman down. This is Della, my wife. Lord Stark. She was calm, cool, not at all discomposed, and all in all impressive. Mance Raider had chosen wisely. And this is Dalla's sister, Val. The hood came down and Ned blinked. If Dalla had been impressive, Val was even more so. Young, blue-eyed, utterly composed, and with a gaze that seemed to take everything in. Oh, and very beautiful. He looked at his eldest son, nephew, and ward. They were all staring at Val like a direwolf puppy would stare at a bone with some raw meat attached to it. Yearning was the word. Raider nodded slightly, and then turned to the gate, where the first of his people were coming through. And what a collection they were. Old and young, men and women, some dressed in furs, some dressed in thick tunics, some dressed in what looked like pieces of armor, some had horses, others shaggy little gray donkeys, some dragged litters, others small handcarts. Dogs trotted next to some families, lanky little things that looked more like wolves at times. Goats were herded through, along with white-coated sheep, and even the occasional shaggy cow. Mance Raider stood by Ned, and watched them pass south, that long line of humanity that represented the wildlings, the free folk, call them what you will, fellow men and women who were fleeing for their lives from something unimaginably terrible. After a while Ned realized that Raider's eyes were shining from unshed tears. Perhaps some food for your family, Ned suggested gently. I think that we need to talk. Raider smiled, a strained smile. Yes, he said thickly, before clearing his throat and trying again. Yes, that might be a good idea. Your pardon, Lord Stark, Lord Commander. I promised those people that I'd get them somewhere safe, away from the White Walkers, somewhere where they'd not see their children turned into whites. I've kept my promise. Detrior Mormont turned and looked at his former brother with an odd, almost sympathetic look. It's good to be reminded of that, he said, and then helped to escort Raider to his office, where he poured out mugs of ale for all three of them. Luck, he toasted. Aye, they all tossed, and then drank. Before Raider turned to Ned, well now, Lord Stark. Yes, we do need to talk. I imagine that you'll need my word again on keeping that lot under control. I'll not lie to you, I've got a lot of influence with them, but my word is hardly law. Oh, I know that, but some influence is better than none. Besides, there's a few things you should know about. There's some people already in the gift. The mountain tribes from the Vale, for a start. Raider paused for a moment and then drank some more ale with a gulp. The old blood sings, does it not? Oh, it sings. The king is coming to Winterfell too. He has found a Durden artifact, something called Stormbreaker. Old things are waking up. Aye, Raider said quietly. Aye. Then he looked at Ned. So, your boys are here then. You still plan to go to the Night Fort tomorrow? Will you be ready? I will. Tormund too. He stared at the fire for a moment, and the skin drew tight at his temples as he seemed to take a deep breath. Lord Stark, Lord Commander, if we survive this winter, if we live through this war of the living against the dead, then we must have a new beginning beyond the wall. I have done much thinking on this, and we must try and repair the breach between men north and south of the wall. The free folk were once scouts for the Night's Watch. I would have them return to that old alliance. It will not be easy, but it must be done. He took a deep breath. I would have my child born into a world of hope and not a world of death and hate. Ned blinked and then exchanged a considering glance with Jeor Mormont. Your wife is with child, then? She is. He smiled slightly. So is mine, and your thoughts echo mine. I would have peace on the wall, peace beyond the wall. Raider shifted uneasily in his chair. We need peace. I am just unsure about how to go about this. I have influence, but I am no king. If Dala gives birth to a son, then he will not be king. Beyond the wall after me. I have given some thought to it. However, I would offer alliance between your family and mine. He was very pale now, like a man walking willingly on thin ice. Val is a great beauty. I would offer her as a marriage alliance to one of your sons, if I may. Ned felt his eyebrows fly up for an instant, before he got them under control. Then he leant back in his chair and thought deeply. It was an interesting offer. It would start to mend the gaping wounds between north of the wall and south of it. It would bind Raider closer to Winterfell, and it would cause his wife to gape at him and half the great houses of the north to wonder if he had concussion. Once people moved beyond that, however, I think that this is something we must carefully discuss, Raider, he said eventually. Then he smiled slightly. Perhaps it would be easier if you had a title. Lord Raider of House Raider, perhaps. The other man looked at him questioningly, before throwing back his head and laughing. When he recovered, he seemed to realize that Ned was not laughing, and that the Lord Commander had an eyebrow raised at Ned, which then came down, as he seemed to come to the right conclusion. You're not serious? Raider barked. I am, Ned replied. You need us, and we need you. Alliance. The king beyond the wall stared at him, and then he put his hand out. Ned took it. Alliance. Jeor Mormont nodded, before standing up. And now comes the dickering, so I shall get more ale. Arya. It was strange, having to think so hard, and she felt that in the last few weeks she'd thought more about life than she ever had before. Winterfell felt almost quiet these days. With Father and Jon and Robb and Theon away, she missed the booming laugh of the great Jon, the quiet jokes of Lord Reed, and above all she missed Jon's quiet wisdom. Because she needed wisdom right now. She was a warg. She knew that now, beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, what now? She'd been so busy trying to be a warg that she hadn't really ever thought about the implications of it all. What would she do as a warg? Yes, she could bite Septa, Mordan's toes, and then run away, but what if the Septa hurt Nymeria afterwards, by throwing something at her? She'd never thought of that. Why hadn't she thought of that? Too busy trying to be warg. She sat on her bed and looked at her dire wolf, who looked back at her with her head tilted to one side. And then she concentrated. Concentrated hard. It was still difficult to do, easier than it had been at first, but still hard. After a moment she closed her eyes, opened them again, and then found herself looking at her own face. The white eyes were always a bit of a shock. She wondered how Mother would react if she ever came upon her body when she was warging. It wouldn't be easy to explain. She gathered herself and then jumped off the bed. Having 4 feet was still interesting, but she'd long since mastered walking, had progressed to scampering, and she might even be up to running soon. The tail was still a bit of an odd thing to control, but she was getting used to it. Having trotted twice around the room to get her bearings and her balance, she then walked over to the door, nosed it carefully open, stepped through, pulled it closed, and then looked up and down the corridor. Perfect. No one around. She darted down it, turned left at the end, and then came to a halt. She had a decision to make. Keep exploring or... Something whiffled in her ear, and she almost yelped with surprise. When she turned around, she saw that Summer was there, right next to her. The other direwolf was staring at her, tilting his head from side to side as if baffled about something. She glared back at him, and then Summer seemed to blink rapidly, and then sit back on his haunches and resumed staring. She stared back at him, and then he huffed quietly and trotted up the corridor. Halfway to the next corner, he turned and looked at her, as if trying to tell her to follow him. Somewhat baffled, she followed him. Much to her interest, Summer led her straight to Bran's room. The other direwolf nosed the door open, and then led her to the bed. There she could see a motionless figure lying there, face turned to one side. Bran, it was Bran, and his eyes were white. She stared at her brother, astonished, and then she looked back at Summer, who was staring at Bran as well. at which point the color returned to Bran's eyes. He blinked several times, and then sat up. What a strange dream, he muttered, before spotting her. Nymeria, what are you doing here? She huffed and then yipped at him, and then she reached deep inside herself and returned to her own body. Bran was a warg too. She felt a vague sense of frustration that she was not unique, along with a joy that Bran was a warg as well. Excited, she got to her feet and then pelted down the corridor. Nymeria was just leaving Bran's room as she arrived, and her puzzled direwolf looked happy to see her. She knocked very briefly and then darted into the room. Rhea? Bran asked sleepily. What's wrong? You were warging. What? You were warging. You were in summer? What? How do you know? Because I was warging too. I was in Nymeria. I was in the corridor, and then Summer came up to me and blew in my ear, and then he led me up the corridor and into your room, and I could see that you had white eyes. Totally white eyes, which is what happens when you warg, and then you woke up and you asked me what I was doing here, but you thought I was just Nymeria. You're a warg too, Bran. Her brother stared at her as if she had gone raving mad. What? She scowled at him and then walked over to the door and closed it. The two direwolves were next to the fire and were curling up and getting ready to go to sleep. We need to talk, she told Bran seriously. There's a lot you need to know,